My name is Alan Hertzke. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Oklahoma. And my boss, Kyle Harper, was just on the previous panel, my provost. And I wanted to take just a moment of personal privilege before we get started on this panel. I've been working with the Georgetown Center for many years. It's very gratifying to see this particular project have its launch. But this is very special for me personally on All Saints' Day to be celebrating this event because I was raised Lutheran and joined the Catholic Church later in my adult life. And the first time I went to an official event at the Vatican and got to walk through the back door into the Basilica and tour it, the first thing that came into my head was, and they built this with all those indulgences. I mean, I couldn't even look at all the splendor. It was that was clearly on my mind. But it's also a more personal reflection that this day would be very special to a man, my uncle and godfather, who was a Lutheran pastor for many years, a church planter for the American Lutheran Church. Beloved uncle, godfather, and he lived to be 93. Hail fellow, jovial, always with a joke. I was visiting him maybe a few months before he died in his little apartment in the assisted living center. And I noticed on his desk there was a Luther bobblehead statue. And I said, oh, that's cute, this Luther bobblehead. And he touched it, and the bobblehead went back and forth, Luther bobblehead. And then, out of the depths of his Lutheran soul, and I'll try to repeat exactly the emphasis, and he just started to repeat as if he was channeling something from beyond. He said, I cannot and I will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God. And that's how he said it in the little assisted living center. And I went, I think he was right that when I joined the church, he said, oh, Hertzke, you're just going to bring your Lutheran soul into the Catholic Church. I think he was right about that in some sense, because there's some sense in which this conference about Christianity and its diverse forms and its contributions to free societies, ideas and institutions of freedom is very central to my own soul. Well, let me introduce the panel and do so by saying this, that when Tim Shaw and I began the process of commissioning scholars, this was a vision that he had and some others that contributed to this event. The idea was to commission both historians, distinguished historians, to look at the roots and antecedents of modern notions of freedom, free societies, and so forth, religious freedom, but also to commission contemporary scholars to look at the role of Christianity in leavening societies, promoting justice, promoting freedom, human rights, human dignity, around the world. And we couldn't have, I think, appreciated the extent to which there would be a close correspondence between these two volumes. But what really did, in fact, emerge powerfully is the notion, is the reality that Christianity, for all of its human flaws, carries deep in its DNA a conception of human dignity rooted in the idea of imago Dei, that we're made in the image and likeness of God, of universal human dignity, that is in fact, that DNA is carried across the centuries and now around the world, we say across space and time. And so this panel is going to illustrate the contemporary contributions. And we have a wonderful panel of three of the contributors, two contributors to the contemporary volume, and Dan Philpott, who contributes kind of a bridge to both. And then a distinguished scholar here, Jacques Berlinderblau from Georgetown. So let me just introduce our panelists. I'll be fairly brief, but I'll start with you, Jacques. He's a professor and director of Jewish civilization at Georgetown's School of Foreign Service. He's published a variety of works on the Hebrew Bible, modern Jewish intellectuals, but particularly important for our panel, and I'm going to be asking him to comment on this, is on secularism and secularity, and the ways in which that comes out. And we'll be looking at maybe the Christian contributions to, or the challenges from, secularism and secularity. And then next to him is Fenggang Yang, who contributed an incredible chapter to our volume on Christianity in China, has a remarkable prediction that the Chinese Christians will surpass the United States in the number of Christians in the world, to be the most Christian, highest Christian population in the world. And he's the director of a center at Purdue that does extraordinary research on religion in China generally, with huge teams of researchers. He is unique in having access to what's going on in China in all kinds of ways. I'm tremendously happy to have you here, Fenggang. And then Sarah Senga also contributed to our volume. She finished her doctorate on Dalit, Christian Dalit communities in Pakistan. She's from Pakistan. Did her dissertation on that and also contributed a chapter on Christianity in Pakistan that we'll be talking about here. Tremendously happy to have you, Sarah. And then my good friend Dan Philpott, professor at the University of Notre Dame, and prolific author and a scholar whose work bridges both the historical and the contemporary, because he's looked at the role of Christianity, Catholic, Protestant, especially in promoting and disseminating, promoting democracy around the world and its role, but is also working on a book now on religious freedom in Islam. And perhaps we'll be able to talk about some of that in our conversation. So as the panel at the end, we have to keep things lively. So I've actually encouraged my panelists, if I'm getting dull or if things are dragging, to interrupt, chime in, and we'll have plenty of time for some audience questions and commentary as well. But let me just start with this, and I'll ask all panelists to sort of share their thoughts. In our Christianity and Freedom volumes, we do argue, both Tim and I, that this DNA, this theological conception of universal human dignity, is conducive to ideas and practice of freedom. So I wanted to have each of you share in your own research or in your chapter how that plays out. So perhaps I'll let you start, Dan, and we'll take it from there.
Well, thank you, Alan. It's a great honor to be here. It's been a fantastic day so far. So in my chapter, I look at Christian contributions to freedom from about 1800 to the present. And this is a very interesting period in world history because it's the period where liberal democratic institutions and human rights and international law and law based on rights and civil rights and so forth are propelling ahead, very quickly. And not without a lot of stops and starts and, exceptions. But this is the period where these kinds of institutions are really taking off, at least where they're taking off. Coming out of the French Revolution and the development of the notion of the rights of man and so forth. And in academia, which I'm a proud member of, I think the dominant narrative in political philosophy, where I come out of, the dominant narrative is that these institutions take off primarily because Christianity has been sidelined from history. And there are, like for instance, probably the greatest political philosopher in the last generation, John Rawls, many times in his writings, he comes back to this idea that these notions of liberalism and institutions of liberalism are made possible because we got past the religious wars. We got past the wars that Martin Luther set off, and he finds it on both repression on both sides and so forth and so on. Lots of other, in the kind of secular liberal tradition, lots of other philosophers take that view, that kind of Enlightenment narrative. But also, there are Christians and conservatives who kind of take that view as well. Kind of in the Leo Strauss tradition, there's the notion that modernity really involves a break. I forgot who said that earlier today, where you had to kind of put Christianity aside and then liberal democracy could kind of burst forth. But what my chapter does is to challenge that. And I find numerous Christian leaders, philosophers, activists who are propelling human rights, anti-slavery, the cause of religious liberty, the cause of democracy. And now I'm not necessarily making a claim about their numbers, because there are also lots of Christians who are on the side of the ancien regime or on the side of slavery or what have you. But nevertheless, this period is populated with Christians who are not just kind of going along with something that the secular forces already, set in train, but are actually doing the propelling, doing the shaping, and the other, one of the key claims of the chapter is that they're doing this on the basis of their Christian convictions. They're not just saying, oh, Christianity needs to sign on to Rousseau or what have you. They're doing it for reasons that are rooted in things like the Imago Dei and reaching back to early Christianity, the separation of powers, and so forth. Anyway, lots of details. That's the basic thesis. I can let some others talk.
All right, very good. Sarah.
Okay, so in my chapter, I actually focused on contemporary Christian community in Pakistan, but also analyzing their history in the formation of Pakistan, which is in one of the ways that they contributed to the freedom not just of their own community, but also to the freedom for the Muslim movement. And in that sense, during the colonial period, it's something that's not discussed enough that for the movement for Pakistan was, yes, largely generated by Muslims and by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, but it also had a very strong Christian following and a very strong Christian membership. And one of the reasons for that was political, but also religious. It's because the Christian community at the time felt more of an affinity with the Islamic community than they did with the Hindu community, and they felt that they would be sort of better off if they went with Pakistan instead of staying in India for a variety of reasons. One of these reasons that I explore in my chapter is actually related to the concept of caste, and it's because the majority of Protestant Christians in South Asia come from a low caste background, and it's one of the reasons that it made them very hesitant when the political powers were changing, that if they stayed within a Hindu environment, there was a higher probability of the fact that they would be sort of discriminated by their previous caste ancestry or their caste membership or their historical sort of belonging to caste groups. So many of them were then motivated to come to Pakistan, and they actually fought by voting for not just ideologically voting for Pakistan, but also showing up in numbers to to be demographically counted as Muslims. Actually is one of the things that the Christians did. When the country was being divided, it was being divided demographically, so the place that had majority Muslims became Pakistan, as many of you know. And one of the things that the Christians did to help this movement is that they asked for the British during the boundary commissions to count the Christian community as Muslim so that their numbers were increased, and so certain regions that should have remained in India came into Pakistan. It's a very big contribution that they made, not just to the community, freedom of their community, but also to the formation of Pakistan, which has been sort of historically kind of, covered up and not really discussed for many reasons. But anyway, and then from there I sort of talk about how that legacy of freedom has continued in Pakistan today with Christians basically trying to promote different forms of freedom, either social or through interreligious dialogue or civic action in the contemporary period in the country through maintaining and creating organizations such as dialogue centers and orphanages and social working centers that keep their viewpoint and their beliefs and also their perspectives very, very active in a society that's becoming more and more Islamic as time goes on.
And one thing I'd like to echo from Sarah's work is that the contemporary volume is a global volume, because right. Christianity is global, and in fact, Christianity in the West may be shriveling in some respects, but it is booming in many other parts of the world, which leads, of course, to Feng-Yang Young's contribution and ongoing work on Christianity in China. What's going on there?
First of all, to start with the chapter. The chapter one I was asked to do is more focusing on the contemporary. I said I want to go back at least to the beginning of the 20th century. At that
and that's
time,
okay with us.
Right, so eventually that worked out fine. And because at that time, even though Christians were a tiny minority, less than 1% of the population, it's very much a fruit of missionaries from Europe and the US or North America. But in terms of freedom in China, in the Republican Revolution in 1911, the leader of the revolution was a Christian. Sun Zhongshan was a Christian, and also many of his comrades were Christian, disproportionately Christian. So they contributed to the overthrow of the Qing or the Manchu monarchy and established the first republic in Asia. And in the provisional constitution under Sun Zhongshan, it had the clause of religious freedom for all citizens. And that's 1911, 1912. So it's very pioneering in China. So that's the back in the early 20th century. But then the republic fall apart, and it's really authoritarianism or even totalitarianism took over for many decades, both under the communists, but also under the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang were defeated in mainland China and withdrew to Taiwan and imposed a martial law in Taiwan for several decades. But then in the 1980s, and the democracy movement picked up in Taiwan and eventually led to the implementation of the constitution that they passed in the late 1940s under the Kuomintang in the Republic of China before the Communist Revolution. And so in the 1970s, actually, the democracy movement in Taiwan were very much led by leaders who were Christian, both Christian individuals and also the Taiwan Presbyterian Church. And they passed the Human Rights Declaration in the 1970s and two other declarations. That really started the democracy movement in Taiwan. So that's the second contribution that making the Chinese society with enlarged freedoms, not only religious freedom, but also civil political rights. And now in Taiwan, it's, in terms of religious freedom, is perhaps even doing better than in the US, right? So it's really
According
free.
to Pew, you're right. You're right about that. The US is declining.
And so that's the second occasion. Then thirdly, in Hong Kong a few years ago, the umbrella movement, that's another clearly a call for democratization, for universal suffrage election. And it also accidentally, maybe not so accidentally, most of the leaders were Christian. Actually, the key leaders. If you count 5 of the key leaders, 4.5 are Christian. One was baptized as a child, but not active in church attendance. So that's the third one. I could say within mainland China, since 2000, early 2000, there's a rise of Christian lawyers. The lawyers who fight for civil rights, human rights, for all people, not only for Christians, but for others as well. For Falun Gong, for Tibetan Buddhists, for Uyghur Muslims. So the contribution of Christians in China, not only for the fight for their own religious freedom, but also this new rising Christian lawyers fighting everyone's freedom. And interestingly, many of the social political activists are converting to Christianity rather than first as Christian, then doing those things. It's during the fight for human dignity, they need to find an anchorage for their fight. So there's a clear association of the expansion of freedom and the rise of Christianity in China.
Very good, thank you. And Jacques?
Hi, first of all, thank you to the Berkley Center. It's nice to be speaking again with Berkeley and at Berkeley. I guess I'm here to provide the vinegar of secularism. I wasn't a contributor to the book, but if I have value added, I can help folks think through this word that appears in many of the interesting contributions. I had a chance to read volumes 1 and volume 2 over the week, and it was really good. I very much liked the piece by, was it Remy Brague, about human dignity?
Remy Brague, yeah.
So as I understand what the book is doing, especially in volume 1, it's drawing attention to what we might call seminal contributions that we owe to Christianity. After 9/11, and the date isn't adventitious, I embarked on a 15-year odyssey to understand what secularism was. What I didn't know when I embarked on the odyssey was I was going to discover that if I sequenced the genome of secularism, I would discover a Christian taproot. It's a very peculiar finding because I offer it to the world with a few other scholars and absolutely nobody wants it. So if we date the New Atheist movement to 2004, 2005, we all know who the New Atheists are, and they glommed onto this word secularism and they completely blurred the distinction between atheism and secularism, and I assure you they are very, very different ideas. Though I also believe atheism has a Christian taproot. You might want to read Father Berkley, the origins of modern atheism. The argument has been made by many scholars that if we didn't have Christianity, we wouldn't have atheism, but I guess that's a conversation for another day. So the taproots of secularism, as I understand them, and as I tried to reconstruct it, went roughly, we're going very fast, folks, from Paul in the New Testament to Augustine to the investiture conflicts to William of Ockham and that very sinister thinker Marsilius of Padua to Martin Luther, which is where we are today, and then it explodes and accelerates into the modern world. So the communities that were most interested in learning about the finding didn't like the finding. So New Atheists did not like the idea that the modern notion of secularism, and I will define it, I guess, in due course, there are many ways to define it, had a very heavy Christian lineage. I mean, Augustine and Luther, you can't get more Christian than that. But Christians didn't like it either, because what Luther didn't foresee in his 1523 essay, which very few people have read, called On the Secular Authority, is he never would have imagined that his normative conception of the good Christian polity, which was ruled by a secular Christian prince, I know that sounds very odd, he never would have imagined it would have exploded into what we now know as separationism, right? Think of the Everson case of 1947 forward. So I traffic in paradox, I traffic in contradiction. These types of findings accrue me no audience and no celebrity because nobody particularly likes them. But I am here to tell you on this 500th anniversary of the great Janus-faced Martin Luther that the conception of secularism is chock full of Christian political philosophical DNA.
Could you tell us kind of your definition, because I think it's very helpful. The word has become so muddied in contemporary discourse. John.
Sure. Secularism refers to a sequence of political philosophies. There are many. There's not just one idea. First, let's put to the side that it's atheism. That's the single most crippling misconception about it's not atheism. It never has been. The person who founded the word, who invoked the neologism, that's George Jacob Holyoake, was adamant that secularism was not atheism, and he invented the word, right? So from its very beginning, it's always been enmeshed with atheism. So what would I say it is? And let's think of our Augustine, if you want to crack it out, right? Think of the idea, all secular models work with an idea that in any given polity, there is an earthly sphere on earth and a heavenly sphere on earth. There is a civil authority and an ecclesiastical authority. And I hope you're all stampeding in your minds to Augustine's City of God, all right? And Luther, being an Augustinian monk, works within this binary. So without going into the whole thing, basically any secularism as we know it posits two analytical levels within a society, the ecclesiastical and the civil authority, and tries to measure what the proper relations between the two are. Most secularisms that I know of, and here we get to the inheritance that Christians don't want to claim, most secularisms that I know of demand that the ecclesiastical authority, that is the church, be subordinated to the civil authority, which we now know as the state. And this is why very few Christian thinkers want to acknowledge their paternity over this very powerful, puzzling, and paradoxical idea.
All right, very good. Thank you. This actually brings us to another question I had for all of us, which is the extent to which Christianity's contributions to freedom come in interaction with other religious communities or with secular authorities, other movements, ethnic, religious, and so forth. Because Christianity's DNA doesn't get worked out in a vacuum. So I'd like each of you to sort of comment on that. You know, how Christianity's contributions, contemporary, historical, are sort of worked out or provoked by their encounter with others and so forth. So, Dan, why don't you start with that?
Well, I recall, I think it was in 2005, Pope Benedict offered a reflection on how religious freedom arose. And interestingly, he gave a lot of credit to the French Revolution. Now, you wouldn't think that a Catholic, you don't usually hear that, a Catholic Pope giving credit to the French Revolution. The French Revolution, of course, killed many priests and nuns and outlawed the kind of church and so dissevered it from the Pope, and we know the story. But I think what he was saying was that there was a kind of a grand historical dialogue that was provoked by the Enlightenment. Eventually, the Catholic Church in 1965 in Dignitatis Humanae offers a grounding for religious freedom that is distinctively Catholic and on Catholic roots, and very different from the kind of thing that the Jacobins or Rousseau are arguing for, and certainly Pope Benedict thought that the Catholic version was better. But I think what he was trying to say is that in the kind of trajectory, the historical trajectory, the process, the genealogy, if you will, there was a kind of dialectic. It wasn't just that the Catholic Church just kind of discovered it on its own, but however the Holy Spirit worked through these complex historical processes, there was a kind of dialogue and a give and take. And after Dignitatis Humanae, John Paul II also made efforts to repent and apologize for what had been called integralism, and so the church very much embraced this, and through this kind of distinctive rationale, but one developed through a dialogue with the secular.
And I was hearkening back to my uncle. He said to me, "Well, Vatican II was very important to me as a Lutheran."
Yes.
Right? Because it acknowledged me as a brother in Christ.
Yes.
So in that sense, it wasn't so shocking for me to join the Catholic Church.
Yeah, a real sea change in relationship to the what are now called the separated brethren.
Yeah,
right.
Not brethren, separated.
Yes, right. So Sarah,
I have your opposite stories. My dad's Catholic and my mother's Lutheran, so I was raised Lutheran. So.
Oh my goodness.
Anyway, we rejected Catholicism young.
I didn't realize we were soulmates. This is fascinating.
Exactly.
So Sarah, you've already talked about the extent to which Christians and Muslims worked in Pakistan together, and the dynamic of the Dalits, especially, or the untouchable, or the lower caste peoples, particularly being drawn to Christianity. So I'd like you to talk a little bit more about sort of the context of Christianity in maybe contemporary Pakistan as well.
Yeah, I mean, so, and I work, quite a bit all over South Asia, not just in Pakistan, but also in India, looking at the Muslim minority there. And the thing with Christianity is, it's, as you said, it's never been, it did not develop in a vacuum, and it does not evolve in a vacuum. And in South Asia, with the amount of religious pluralism that we have, Christianity, does develop in very interesting ways because of its interaction with multiple religions, not just Islam and Hinduism, but also Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, Zoroastrianism, because we have so many different traditions. And then with its own caste ancestry, that is something that Christians in India and Pakistan struggle with, because it's an ancestry which to them in one way is a source of shame. It's a source of it's when you are an untouchable in the South, in the subcontinent, basically. I'm not going to say just India, but in the subcontinent, you it is acknowledged that you come from the lowest rungs of society, that the sort of jobs that you do were determined by your birth, that there is a social hierarchy of which you are at the lowest rung. So there is an inherent kind of shame that comes from being a member of that society. And many people were drawn to Christianity for that reason, as you said, but also for that reason, many people were at that time period drawn to Islam as well, because of the radical equality that Islam offered. Because of the appeal to Christianity came through the stories of Jesus, the narratives of Jesus, the social gospel, the idea that Jesus sort of loved everybody, ate with everybody, broke the moral codes of his time to extend his hand out to people. The story of the Good Samaritan, for example, is something that resonates highly with untouchable communities because it's about breaking stereotypes and boundaries and parameters and social codes and mores, which is something that in Hindu society in particular it's very sort of codes of touchability and untouchability, especially things like interdining and intermarriage and things like that are very, very strongly determined through caste relationships. So that's one of the reasons that Christianity becomes something that's attractive to these people. But what I look at also in my work is how much of the Christian traditions that are existing in South Asia right now are really what I would call syncretic traditions. So it's Christianity that has amalgamated parts of untouchable religions and Christianity that has amalgamated parts of Muslim rituals and beliefs and traditions and things like that. So when you go into a lot of churches in Pakistan, you will see that they use Islamic terms for things. So they'll say, for example, when they're taking the church collection, they'll ask for zakat, which is the Islamic term for charity, or they will have a lot of sort of images in churches in India and Jesus will be among those because they've amalgamated parts of the Hindu tradition with them. So Christianity is very adaptive I think much more so in South Asia than it is in other parts of the world.
So we might say, in the Catholic world, we might say they're enculturating the faith within the local cultures. Others might say they're syncretic, right?
Right, but there's also a lot of sort of stories, though, that come out of these areas about stories that didn't happen. Like there's lots of stories in Pakistan about how Jesus was in Pakistan, which he wasn't. But so it's sorry, but there's if you go into a lot of these low caste churches, there are very, very strong narratives about how Jesus and the apostles were there and how they spent all this time, they did all these things, and you're like, actually, no, they really didn't, and that's a Buddhist temple, and it was never a church. But the stories also give them a sense of a political claim to an area that is kind of growing smaller for them in terms of having theological space, and that's one of the reasons they do it.
I might add that both Sarah's work and also the work of Rebecca Shaw, who has a chapter on especially women and Dalit women in India, that the Dalits have developed a whole theology, which to me is quite Christian. The notion that since Christ was, brutalized and hung on a cross, he is the characteristic Dalit, the shattered person, the broken person. Yeah. So the Dalits have embraced this notion that they are like Christ.
It's a South Asian form of liberation theology, but Dalit, the actual word, it's a relatively new term, and it means the crushed or the oppressed and the fully broken. So the three basic Sanskritic meanings for the crushed. The broken is not broken as in it's actually broken open, so split open, if you think about the heart being split open in that sense, but then also crushed and marginalized. And there's a theological movement that argues that at the moment that Jesus becomes the Christ, so at the moment that he's on the cross and he's actually crucified is when he is broken open, when his heart is split open, he's full of compassion, he's full of undying love for humanity, and at that moment when he's crushed, he becomes the sort of the most untouchable of all people, or the greatest Dalit of all people. And so that's where they find their liberation theology to come from, although people have critiqued this and said that it kind of highlights suffering a little too much, and the concept that we have to sort of be brutalized before we can be children of God.
So thinking, you actually alluded already to the way in which Christians, especially Christian lawyers, are defending, so for example, Falun Gong. But of course, local Christian communities, some of them probably see the Falun Gong as a dangerous cult, right? So how do Christian communities work out some of these relationships with other communities, and in a sense, do they have a common cause in trying to carve spaces for civil society?
Of course, most Christians in China are theologically conservative. We could say they're evangelical or fundamentalist Christians. Of course, in their theology, they would think the other faiths are wrong, right? So that's a characteristic of it. But at the same time, I think now the Christian lawyers have become accepted by those churches, is that they realize as minorities, religious minorities, we, anyone who is being persecuted, we share the same possible fate because those minorities can be persecuted and injustice done on them. So we need to defend their rights as well as our own rights. I think that for Christians in China, because they have been minority, a small minority, so this is not a big issue within the Christian community, I would say. Actually, back in the 1920s, during the early Republican period, discussing about the Constitution, there was a fierce debate about whether the Constitution should have a special place for Confucius, right? Confucianism was the dominant ideology in China after the Qing dynasty, and Confucianism lost that privileged status. And then the president of the Republic of China wanted to restore monarchy and also worship Confucius and worship the heaven. At that time, there are strong opposition to that. Among them are really the secularists, the secular intellectuals who learned from the French Enlightenment, saying no, there's no space for religion in public life. So of course we should oppose making Confucius privileged. But at the same time, it's really the Protestants led the effort to in that discussion and joined forces with Buddhists, Muslims, and Taoists to oppose, to make Confucius a special place in the Constitution. That's in the 1920s, the 1930s. And they succeeded, basically. So the Constitution really did not really make Confucianism the official religion. And so that's now it's not new. Mm-hmm. But in recent 2 decades, there's a rise of Confucianism again. And the Confucian advocates really often make the argument, watch out, this Christian growth in China is going to bring China back to the Middle Ages of Europe, because Christianity got to be this theocracy, because that has been most of their history. So if the Christians become dominant, they will bring us back to the Dark Ages. But that's really based on misunderstanding. It's not really based on the facts. I think the 2 volumes hopefully can clarify some of that if they pay attention to that.
You know what? One of the themes that came out in these presentations and also in the volume is the extent to which these days Christians are minorities around the world, often suffering under great conditions of persecution and hardship and pressure. So naturally, in a sense, using Jacques' definition, they desire a secular state, one that does not privilege a particular religion, as Islam in Pakistan or Hinduism in India, or Confucianism in China, because they would be, and then they join with other groups, civil society actors, even secularists, to defend, you might say, a neutral secular state, which will enable them then to thrive as independent voluntary associations. And so that's a very useful contribution that I think Jacques brought into the conversation. And I wanted to ask you, Jacques, that yes, you've provided the secular perspective, which is very valuable, but I'm wondering if you have some thoughts as a scholar of Jewish civilization, if Christians are claiming too much, in a sense, and not acknowledging our elder brothers and sisters who were the carriers of Imago Dei, the idea that we're made in the image and likeness of God, and in some sense carrying that around the world as well. I'm just wondering.
Look, Genesis 1:27 to 1:28, the idea that we're all created in the image of God has to be one of the greatest ideas, right, ever, full stop, right? I mean, could any author, or authors, as I argue, right, have done better than to put that verse into existence? Maybe where I part ways is for every great biblical verse, I can find, Leviticus 18, whatever, right? The verses about same-sex eroticism. So my views on what we might call the Judeo-Christian tradition were best encapsulated in a book I wrote in 2005 called The Secular Bible. I said, rather than looking at our scriptures, be it Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, Old Testament, New Testament, and Quran, as saying this, right? Why don't we become more hermeneutically sophisticated, as we all are, and argue that sacred scripture is a vast repository of incredible ideas, some better than others, right? But what really makes a religious community is the way they interpret these ideas, right? So I used to get into a lot of trouble for saying I'm bored by original texts. I don't care who the prophet Isaiah was. I don't care if he lived. I don't want to read the Dead Sea Scrolls anymore, which is all you do when you study philology. That's what I did. I didn't want to read it in original languages, right? I, with a variety of interpreters, came to the conclusion that what was most important was the interpretive community and what they were taking out of these particular texts. So sure, there are these phenomenal ideas, right, in the Hebrew Bible, in the New Testament, which are there to be picked over by generation after generation. But my caution, because I sense this is I won't call it Christian triumphalism, that's not what I'm trying to say. It's a happily Christian book, right? It argues, most of its chapters argue, justifiably, Christianity is a great world religion. It's given us many, many great things, though nobody here is Pollyannish. No one denies that they're. My warning is that later Christian generations could take a verse such as Genesis 1:27, 1:28, and mangle it somehow, all right? Through some exegetical operation from hell, all right? They could find something in that verse which would make us read it in ways that Christians have not traditionally read it. So just a nice caution, speaking a little bit from the Jewish side, especially, I think Jews and Catholics are much better at this than Protestants are in acknowledging the power of interpretation, the necessity of interpretation. This is where our friend Luther is not very good, right? But more importantly, the inevitability of interpretation, right? The great rabbis of blessed memory profoundly understood this, that they were human interpreters enjoined with the task of interpreting the words of the living God. And they knew they would disagree, and often they would disagree with God in some of the most famous, the tale of Achnai's oven, if you're familiar with it. So I want to agree, Alan, right? I absolutely want that there's a Judeo-Christian, but I'd like to place the emphasis more on the interpretive communities and what they make of these texts than the original contributions of the so-called original authors.
Fantastic. I want to turn now to the sort of contemporary scene. One of the things that we focused on in the contemporary volume is the extent to which Christian communities around the world are living under conditions of hardship, pressure, persecution. Not just pressure and persecution, but also hardship, poverty, exploitation, war, violence, refugees, and so forth. The sort of suffering church in a broader sense. And so we focused on that, and then we wanted to look at the extent to which Christians are making distinctive leavening contributions to their societies in the midst of that. Or, under certain circumstances, are those contributions being stifled because they're so oppressed or being cleansed from society? So I'll let any of you sort of chime in on that. In other words, the extent to which Christianity is under siege, but also making contributions, and under what conditions do those contributions come out? Yeah.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the Under Caesar's Sword project, which
Yes,
is precisely about
right.
this. And in a way, the Under Caesar's Sword project is this project 2.0, and the one that we're talking about today. It very much is a sequel to that. And we also had a conference in Rome, and many of the same authors were involved and so forth. But it really takes a look at persecuted Christian communities around the world and asks how do they respond to persecution? What do they do when they're under this kind of pressure? Both Fen Gong and Sarah had chapters in it. And the findings are many. We have a report with 8 findings. I think one of the interesting ones, maybe most stark findings, was the degree to which Christians who are persecuted find creative ways to construct a stronger position, to construct a stronger place for their faith, even under conditions of persecution. There are many responses, of course. Sometimes they just simply flee. Sometimes they maybe even take up violence.
They lash out in some cases.
Absolutely, that's right. And it's hard to generalize. But to a striking degree that we didn't expect were these kind of constructive responses. They build bridges with other churches. They build bridges with the other religion. They build bridges with international human rights actors. They find ways to advocate for religious freedom and for human rights to the degree that they can speak out, that the environment will allow them to do that. Even in highly repressive environments, they often find creative ways to evangelize or to continue, speak a different language or speak the language of the surrounding community in order to kind of deflect suspicion and find ways to carry on their activities under very difficult conditions.
And Sarah, you have written a lot about this.
Yeah, but I just wanted to respond to Dan specifically about the list that we just sort of talked about. I mean, is there something specifically Christian about those things? Because it sounds like that's just what a lot of communities under duress would do, or any marginalized communities would do, right? Like reaching out to an international community or speaking the language or doing whatever. Is there something specifically Christian about that behavior?
Well, I would say that they do it to out of their Christian foundations in order to build and preserve the Christian church. But it isn't to say that other communities couldn't do something like that, under similar circumstances.
Okay, I understand what you're saying. So I think in Pakistan, the Christian community is sort of under duress, but I want to also say that, in the context of Pakistan, it's a failed nation state, so almost everyone in the country is under duress. I don't think anyone's having a good time that I know of. I mean, there's a tiny minority of people who are unaffected by the political and domestic violence and radicalism and other things like that, but Pakistan's been a mess since it, was created. So as far as the Christians go, they do have more power than other religious minorities, which is kind of interesting because they're not
more than the Ahmadiyya, for example?
Well, they're not the largest religious minority. Actually, the largest religious minority in Pakistan is Hindu.
Right.
But the Hindus don't have a lot of political power, largely because almost 98% of the Hindus in Pakistan today are from the untouchable caste. So they literally have no power. And they're also very sequestered. They live out in the province which I'm from, which is Sindh province, and they're kind of sequestered in the desert. So Christians, on the other hand, are urbanized, and they do have some political power. And this is due to largely because of the colonial presence in the country. Christians, so a lot of colonial institutions that are left over in Pakistan, churches, educational facilities, hospitals, orphanages, things like that, the contemporary Christian community has taken them over. So that's one way in which they do levy power. The Hindus don't have much power. We also have a large Zoroastrian community in Pakistan. Outside of Mumbai, the largest Zoroastrian community now is in Karachi, which is my home city. And the Zoroastrians are not politically active in any way. And then, of course, we have a very large Shia population, of which the Ahmadiyya are the most discriminated against. And about 10 years ago, the Ahmadiyya were declared Qadiani in Pakistan, which means that they're actually non-Muslim. They're considered non-Muslim. And this has lots of reasons for it. It's not just like outright discrimination. It's actually related to who gets permission to go to Hajj. There's a certain declaration that you have to sign as a practicing Muslim in order to be permitted by the Saudi Arabian government to perform Hajj and to go to Mecca. And one of those things that you have to sign in the declaration is that the Holy Prophet is the seal of the prophets, which is something that the Ahmadiyyas will not say because they believe that another prophet came after the Holy Prophet. So this prevents them from getting a Hajj visa, and they were therefore declared non-Muslim. Getting a Hajj visa is very complex. It's very complex how every country has a quota and things like that. But anyway, so the Ahmadiyya do take their concerns to the Christian community, and the Christian community does take their issues to Parliament and vote for them on their behalf, because the Ahmadiyya has no political power at all. And they're not permitted to vote now in Pakistan.
You know, that raises an issue or a theme that emerged in our contemporary volume, which is the extent to which you might say, especially in the Middle East, the pluralist fabric of the Middle East, in fact, that Elizabeth Prodromou talked about, the importance of pluralism, is under peril by the forces of collapsed states and ISIS and religious militancy and so forth. And in a way, Muslim dissenters from the Islamist ideology have a big stake in whether Christians remain in the Middle East, as well as the Mahdiya and so forth. So the fate of Christianity in many ways or the fate of other religious minorities and ethnic minorities in the Middle East is really tied to the fate of Christianity, which the theocrats and autocrats know. In a sense, the Christians are the canaries in the coal mine, because you can go after them, then you can also subject the Ahmadiyya and others. Now, I want to turn to you, Feng-Gang, and maybe make it a little bit more pointed, because Feng-Gang in his chapter, remarkable chapter, because he likened China today to the time in the Roman Empire just before the Milan moment, before Constantine, before Christianity becomes, the state religion. Because Christianity was under great persecution, but it was also growing dramatically. And so at the end of your chat, after talking about the dramatic growth of Christianity in China, which I think you say by 2030 will surpass the United States as having the largest Christian population in the world, think about that. You say that perhaps there's a Milan moment in the future, and yet the current regime under Xi Jinping seems to be asserting, is it maybe a Diocletian moment or something? I'm just wondering, what are your reflections now based on what's happening in China with, you might say, the elevation of Xi Jinping and his effort to really clamp down on civil society? What does this mean for the Christians there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Now think about the 4th century Roman Empire. In 303, the great persecution started, right? It's the greatest persecution in the Roman Empire history. But it lasted for 10 years. Then in 313, it was the Edict of Milan. But I want to make a clarification. The Edict of Milan did not make Christianity the official religion. It was on 380. It was made an official religion. So from 313 to 380, Christianity was one of the legally allowed religions. Right? So that's important to remember. Constantine did not make Christianity the official religion, only granted the freedom. Equal freedom to the traditional religions. China is somehow similar in several senses. One is there have been great persecutions. Right? In contemporary human history, only 2 countries totally banned all religions. No single church was allowed. No mosque, no temple was open. And China was one of the 2. What's the other one? Albania, that's right. So the Soviet was not that radical compared with the Chinese and Albanians. So from 1966 to 1979, 0 church was open for religious service in China. But it's during that time, the number of Christians, the number of Protestants in particular, increased 3 times. When there was no church, they increased 3 times, from 1 million to 3 million. Since around 1980, really 1979, religions all came back during the Reform era. And Christians, Protestants around 1980 were 3 million. Then it kept growing, 10% increase every year since 1980. So by 2010, there were about 58 million Protestants. Then there's another 9 million Catholics. So that's if that growing trend continues, by 2030, there will be more Christians in China than all Christians combined in the U.S. It's only 13 years from now. Even the government tried to stop right here. There's an inertia, right? So the people who have been trying to evangelize, have been evangelizing, they will continue to do that until you put them in jail, right? But even in jail, they continue to evangelize, right? Just 3 years ago, 2014, when a pastor in Zhejiang province, he led the campaign to oppose the government's cracking down. The Zhejiang government tried to remove crosses on church rooftops, and one of the church leaders opposed that, and he was put in jail for 1 year. During that 1 year, he came in contact with another 100 fellow prisoners, inmates, and he converted 20 of them, and more than 50 of them expressed sympathy or understanding to Christianity. So as a minority really didn't like Christianity. And so and also the current leadership of Christian churches, especially so-called house churches, the unofficial churches, they are in their late 50s, 60s, or 70s. Many of them converted from non-Christian background during the high days of Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. We have been doing oral history interviews in China. There are some discoveries just really surprising. When the Red Guards were rampaging the whole country, there are the young people converting to Christianity, and now they are the leaders of the church. So
in other words, they've been through a lot. Yeah. They're
Yes.
pretty tough characters.
Right.
And they're not intimidated by Xi Jinping? Is that what you're saying? Or?
No, that's exactly. So this is not a long history. Many of them in their lifetime, they have undergone that very difficult times. So they, in anticipation of the increased restriction, even greater persecution, another round of persecution, surprisingly to me, I'm a kind of outsider. I live in the U.S. So when I talk with those leaders in China, they seem not worried. They just go as usual, do their business. Just less than a month ago, there was a conference in Virginia on this Reformation 500 also. And several house church leaders, pastors came to the conference. I asked them, I said, are you worried? Because there's a new regulations of religious affairs that's going to take effect next February. And that regulation is much more restrictive, very restrictive. You cannot really have gatherings without approval. And the people who rent a place for religious gatherings without approval can be severely penalized. I said, don't you worry? Have you making preparations? They said, no, we'll deal with that. We'll be fine. If we could survive during the Cultural Revolution, we'll survive well this time.
Jacques, do you have any other thoughts you wanted to add?
So if the Prophet Muhammad said there is no coercion in religion, and Luther said basically the same thing, thought is free, one of his most interesting asides. We're also learning from the example of China and Albania, there is no coercion in irreligion. The stupidest secular regimes and the least successful ones are precisely the ones that see an energized religious group and try to break it down, right? And China is a case, if I were to be like a McKinsey consultant for secularism and go to the Chinese leaders and tell them, and obviously we would bring you, say, if you really want a somewhat secular state and you don't want this religion to be as large as Professor Yang says it's going to be in 2030, right? Don't do this, all right? Don't throw them in jails. Don't prevent them from associating publicly. The case of Albania is interesting for one reason. I believe it's the 1967 Albanian. I think it's the first constitution that is explicitly atheist. Right? So we were talking about the difficulties in the term secularism and atheism. That's a form of non-secularism, by the way. One article I wrote way back was, is it possible to be atheist and non-secular? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Right? From the moment that you look at church and state and you say, but there's no room for church in our state, you have moved out of the classic secular binary, which posits these two social, cultural, analytical, governmental levels that have to be moderated against one another. The better example is France, the F word, right? For many in this room, I would imagine. Americans have a real, and maybe we'll light things up as we head to the Q&A. Americans have this real chip on their shoulder. Oh, the French are so terrible. They do this. They've got burkini police. We all know about it. But France is not the United States. The DNA of their secular tradition is very different than this Anglo DNA. Our tradition goes Luther in the Anglo world, right? Luther, Williams, Locke, Jefferson, Madison, very Anglo fellas. The Catholic tradition comes from someplace totally, totally different. An absolute, and I would say somewhat legitimate hatred of the church as it existed between, let's say, 1500 to 1800. And if the French don't want religion in public space, show a little cultural sensitivity and try to understand why the French came to that peculiar conclusion. Why it's interesting in terms of your remark is they don't need us as McKinsey consultants in France. I believe contrary to what Americans think of the French and their laïcité, which is their variant of secularism, it's actually a system that works better than we are willing to acknowledge in terms of giving religious communities a sense that in private, they can do absolutely anything they want. The French don't want it in public, and they have very particular reasons, I would say legitimate historical reasons, for not wanting it. That's the laïque model, not the American model, which is very different.
Do any of you have questions for each other before we turn to the audience? Are you interested?
But I'll just say on the French, I think...
or comments, perhaps. Yes.
Yeah, I think it came to that's kind of what, especially after World War II, and there was kind of a modus vivendi reached between the kind of Catholics figured the monarchy's not coming back, and then the Enlightenmentites figured we could probably live with
the church says, okay, fine.
Yeah.
Do it. Fifth Republic, we got it.
That's right.
Yeah.
But during the Third Republic, though, there were pretty strong efforts to, thousands of teachers were expelled, thousands of priests were expelled. Right. Fairly repressive measures and successfully kind of, Catholic teachers went from like 80,000 to 10,000, and then the secular teachers did the reverse. It was a kind of pretty successfully imposed secularism of a sort.
Henri Peña-Ruiz, who's the great scholar of French laïcité, says French secularism is born in tears and blood. People died for this idea. In the United States, they didn't, right? So our secular tradition is flimsy. France is one of the few countries in the world where it's the only country in the world where being secular polls well. The majority of French citizens feel it's part of their identity. Ask that question to Americans, all right? Very, very few Americans want to own their secular identity, except for maybe new atheists, liberal Jews such as myself, a smattering of Unitarians, right? So it's interesting how the history of a particular country will inform its secular tradition or the strength or the poverty of its secular tradition.
And I'd like to comment on that because I've been looking at the evidence of a rather dramatic increase of both governmental restrictions and religious hostilities, according to the Pew Research Center, in the United States. A doubling since 2007. So the United States used to have what are called low restrictions by governments and social hostilities. They're now in the medium to medium high range, which is astonishing in the cradle of liberty. And I'm really interested in probing the government restrictions we know have everything to do with the zoning issues and Jewish congregations and mosques and being denied the permits to zone, but also some of the new emerging regulatory infringements upon religious communities. But the religious hostilities as well. The kind of thing we saw in Charlottesville, for example. The defacing of synagogues and mosques, Sikh temples and so forth. So we have some work to do here in the United States to, in a sense, reclaim the kind of benevolent neutrality of a state that actually embraces religious freedom, does not try to kind of supplant in a hegemonic way the civil society of a state. So, but with that, any other comments before? Yes, Fenge.
I think this is a very interesting point to follow up. The French model seems to have some particular appeal, right? It's even winning over in the U.S. to some degree. The Chinese first learned from the U.S. model in the first version of the provisional constitution. Then later on, the intellectuals really all embraced the French model, laicité. So the religion has to be under the secular authorities. And then followed with the Soviet model, saying, okay, you guys need to be gone. But the French model, how much is particular to the French? The French church was very powerful, right? The Catholic Church in France, and were able to prevent any Reformation. The Protestant, the Huguenots, and others were severely suppressed. And as a reaction, would you say that? Is that as a reaction to that strong church, so the secularists and the Enlightenment, they went over, so have to forcefully put the church under the secular control. Then the late developing societies trying to model on that. But that may not be the right model because in China, we didn't have a strong church, any church. But the French thinking, laicité, is particularly appealing to educated people.
And it works in France. Ataturk in Turkey, right? They refer to it as laiklik, right? So it's a version of laïcité. Laiklik to me sounds like a secular yogurt, right? That's a joke. And it didn't work, right? It just doesn't work, as we can tell from what happened from Erdogan forward. So trying to take this French model, I think what you're saying is it grows up in a unique soil, all right? And there are unique preconditions that give rise to it, and it works because it's France, right? And if you try to take this model, as Ataturk did, and just impose it on a very different culture, right? It doesn't work, and it ends up being an autocratic, repressive, totalitarian regime, which is what it was.
All right, I think we need to turn to some questions now. So, question here in the front, and there's a microphone coming around. So, introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Christine Craig, and I am a government student from Regent University, Robertson School of Government. I kind of want to piggyback on what you were saying. I'm very intrigued with what you're talking about with the French. I just noticed that the rise in secularism really seems to stem back in our nation, and I could be entirely wrong, but it seems to stem back to maybe even the Scopes monkey trials with the rise in Darwinism. And what I'm finding is that our Supreme Courts and our legislation in our nation is now beginning to change. And therefore, our public square, we may as Christians feel that we have some freedom to still go there, but we're having counter legislation. We're having very secular legislation that seems to go against natural law, seems to go against common sense. I won't name them. I think we all know what I'm talking about. So I guess I'm having a harder time seeing how we're not having problems, how we're not beyond neutral. Because on my end, I'm just sensing that we're at a very fast pace. We're moving right towards secularism, and if we're not careful...
You mean a laic or a French version that's not suited to us? Or?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what version we have. I think right now it's a hodgepodge, but what I'm sensing is we're losing our religious freedom. That's what I'm sensing in the public square, whether it be independent or collective, as a body of Christ. So what can you all specifically say about that?
Well, I disagree so incredibly with you, right? Let me just, as opposed to getting into a disagreement, I think a classic legal understanding of the United States from the Everson case, 47-48, to the Jaffe case, when Justice Rehnquist obliterates the wall of separation. Good argument. He says it's a bad metaphor, it's bad history, it should be explicitly abandoned, right? So the way legal scholars see it, right, is from 47 to 85, Kennedy is the high crest of this. We have something called separationism in the United States, where people actually believe there's this thing called a wall. It's this impermeable wall between church and state, and church is over here and state is over there. And from 85 forward, it starts to crumble, and separationism as a judicial philosophy is dead. I'm thinking of Ira Lupu, The Lingering Death of Separationism, a very important book, this George Washington University law professor. So this might not be your perspective, right? From the perspective of scholars of secularism, this is the absolute low period since maybe the Scopes trial, right? So it hasn't been worse for separationist secularism as it has been now, and then we go the extra step, and then I'll hand it off to my colleagues. We correlate this with the global demise of liberalism, because in case you haven't noticed, liberalism is under siege, in crisis, rotting from within everywhere. And one country I like to point to, because it's very dear to me, is Israel, right? So there's a clear crisis of liberalism in the Jewish state, right? I think liberalism is under attack as never before. There are 3 or 4 very, very good books that have recently come out, and I'm not referring to Mark Lilla's book, which reads more like a screed to me, but there are books about this sense that this liberal/secular amalgam or synergy is in deep, deep trouble, and if I may, compliment to those folks, part of the body of Christ, particularly our white, conservative, evangelical Christian friends, right? I think they destroyed it, right? They did and they did it legally. It wasn't violent, right? They just outsmarted, out-hustled, out-generaled, out-legislated secular intellectuals from the 70s forward. So that's my take.
Let me provide maybe a slight counterpoint to that, Jacques, in the sense that, and I've written about this, in an edited volume on religious freedom in America, where I have a catalog. I keep track of all of these stories. You might call hegemonic state or misinterpretations of the Establishment Clause by school authorities and zoning officials and so forth. And I think the Pew Research Center is picking up on that at the same time, I think you're right about the collapse of the separationist paradigm. But I think free exercise is now under some real pressure as certain new kind of norms of liberals, and maybe not liberal, but progressive norms about equality and so forth on the basis of gender and
Give us
so
an
forth.
example.
The examples that were used earlier, and Dan may pick, but Catholic Charities, which operated a 100-year-old adoption agency in Boston, wasn't getting money. They just needed a permit. And the state said to them, now that we have gay marriage, we will not allow you to only place children in heterosexual married couples. And they said, couldn't you give us an accommodation? Couldn't, and generally scholars like Cole Durham argue that sort of an accommodation of civil society is sort of the sweet spot for free exercise. And so they had to shut it down. In other words, the state said to Catholic Charities, either you run the way we want you to run or you'll shut down. Religious clubs have been closed out of college campuses, Christian clubs only, in a number of places for the same reasons. So there's a sense in which, and I don't think it's the crisis that some people claim. All right, we have a really robust, we've got the Beckett organization taking on all these cases, and often winning. But I mean, the Little Sisters of the Poor had to spend millions of dollars, not their own money, but to defend their right to run their programs for the aged poor,
Right.
under the face of a mandate by the Obama administration that they violate their conscience and offer contraceptive services in their health care plan. So I think there's something happening that you're picking up on. I wouldn't say it's the kind of crisis you are. We have robust religious freedom. But we have to fight for it more now. More litigation. Dan, what were you going to?
Well, coming from the University of Notre Dame, I can give some firsthand testimony too, in the sense that, as everybody knows, my church has a prohibition on contraception. Not very popular even with many Catholics, but nevertheless, it has been the firm, constant teaching of the magisterium of the church. So Notre Dame, from its founding in 1842 all the way up to 2015 or so, had it part of its policies that then we wouldn't provide that in our health care. Of course, employees are free to use it if they like or purchase it or what have you. There's no prohibition, but just that we wouldn't pay for it and provide it. But then, then it came up that, we all know the story. Then it was the mandate that said that religious, with very narrow exemptions, religious employers had to provide it, and then So just last week, or I guess earlier this month, and it was finally then reversed, and then Notre Dame has now decided then to go back to the previous policy. But we see that as a matter of freedom.
You're saying that Notre Dame actually acceded to the mandate?
Well,
The
under an
ACA
accommodation
under
that
an
allowed for a third-party provider
Okay.
to provide it. That we
Right.
wouldn't have to pay for it. But and that was judged by Notre Dame to be not complicit, morally.
That wasn't
complicit
good
and so
enough for the
forth.
Little Sisters.
Yeah,
it
but
was
we
good enough
still
for-
kept the lawsuit. There was some complications, but we still had the lawsuit. But now we've settled the lawsuit. We've gone back to the previous policy. But I would argue that's something that is critical to the kind of religious understanding of the Catholic Church, and that it ought to be allowed to do that. To have
Libertas
to
ecclesia,
have
the
a
liberty of the
wide,
church.
yeah, exactly, a kind of wide ambit, a wide remit to be able to practice that, as other institutions would as well, according to their own beliefs.
And I would also say that I think that we should be very attentive to the extent to which certain kind of new virulent forms of
Yes,
tribalism,
absolutely,
ethno-nationalism, white
yes.
nationalism are also
From that
very
direction as
dangerous,
well.
very
Yeah.
dangerous to the civic
Yes, I would
fabric
too,
of the
yeah.
United States and to a kind of cultural or societal understanding
Absolutely,
of religious freedom.
yeah.
I mean, the idea of American grace, that Putnam and Campbell write about, that we can combine intense religious conviction with broad religious tolerance, that is under great question now, which I'm shocked by, but it is. Other questions? Yes, Paul Marshall over here, the distinguished Paul Marshall,
Thank you very much. Just
who is
to-
a contributor to our volumes, by the way, and so
Thank you.
go ahead.
I'll give up the microphone now. Just a comment on France, which I tend to find far more pragmatic than a sort of strict laïcité idea would carry. You still have the situation in Alsace-Lorraine, which was not part of France when the 1905 sort of separate laïcité law passed. So the clergy in Alsace-Lorraine are paid by the state, according to the civil service salary scale. And I believe that people here know the Catholic Church structure better than I, but I believe that France is the only country in the world where the head of state appoints the Catholic bishops in Alsace-Lorraine. The prime minister appoints the Protestants. I don't know why this hierarchy. And that was the Constitutional Council upheld the constitutionality of that arrangement as recently as 2013. So you have this, it's anomalous. But you also find that in relating now to the Muslim population of France, they're doing all sorts of accommodations and funding. And I was with some senior Muslim leaders from Indonesia, and they said the most fruitful discussions they had in Europe were with the French, of looking, how is it possible to give religion more public space? So when push comes to shove, the French will do what they think they need to do in terms of dealing with religion. And I would just say, we could learn something from them. Thank you.
All right, another question. There's one here and then one in the back, so right here.
Yeah, my name is Robert Nelson, and I'm from the University of Maryland. Unfortunately, I missed most of the conference due to a faculty meeting and other things, but I've been enjoying this.
The purgatory of faculty meetings.
This discussion. But I thought I'd offer, I've been writing about this whole phenomenon of secularism, and the thrust of my writing about this it's now about 25 years, is that secularism is not secularism. It's just religion in another form. And for example, a recent piece that I wrote was Calvinism without God. American environmentalism as implicit Calvinism. But then I notice, and this is another thing that I've been doing some writing about, is that American environmentalism, because it nominally is secular, is allowed to proselytize in schools and it's basically inculcating a very Calvinist view of the world in a secular dress in a very active way. The children are recycling messages on the walls and everything else. And why wouldn't, and obviously you couldn't do the same thing if it was a Christian, explicitly Christian religion. So why wouldn't we say that Christianity in the United States is being persecuted?
Let me piggyback on that because I want to go to the word persecution before we go to the discussion. Because Sarah and others have written about real persecution as opposed to discrimination or maybe, and so forth. I thought maybe you'd comment on when American Christians or Westerners use the word persecution as happening to them.
I'm baffled by American persecution of Christianity. I have not seen it. Or American persecution of religion. Someone show it to me. I'm not seeing it. But persecution in other countries looks very different. So it's, there's political persecution, of course, where people are quite literally persecuted, as I gave the example of the Ahmadiyas, for beliefs. So because they believe, you can take one viewpoint on it and you can say that from an Islamic perspective, if one of the tenets of the Islamic faith is that you believe the Holy Prophet is the seal of the prophets. So if somebody doesn't believe that, it's kind of like saying, well, if you don't agree with the Nicene Creed, maybe you're not a Christian, maybe you're something else. But the Ahmadiyya do self-identify as Muslim. And then it brings up this notion of, who is the sort of the body in Islam in general that determines where interpretation begins and when it ends and who the prophets are. Because in the Shia tradition, of course, interpretation is done very differently. So the fact that the Ahmadiyya are explicitly kept out of Saudi Arabia, and this is, like I said, it's very related to them getting a Hajj visa because it's a very complex thing to get a Hajj visa. Every Muslim country, if you're an Islamic republic like Pakistan is, you have a Hajj board which determines the quota that is given to that country for that year for how many people are permitted to go to Mecca to go to Hajj. And because of that, the declaration has to be signed if you're a Muslim, and if you're a Muslim citizen of an Islamic country, you must sign that declaration. If at some point in your life you want to go on Umrah or you want to go on Hajj, that paperwork will be checked by Mecca. So the fact that they're not permitting the Ahmadiyyas to sign this declaration means that for all of these Ahmadiyyas who self-identify as Muslim, they will never be permitted to go on Hajj. That I consider a type of persecution.
And in terms of the social realm, we're seeing in many Middle Eastern
that
countries
they cannot vote,
mob violence after accusations, and so
things
forth.
like that.
And also, like what is persecution? One example in China today, there's a church leader in Beijing has been under house arrest for more than 6 years. Yeah. The news has, the news organization forgot about him, and it's not by any law. Actually, the people outside this pastor's apartment have no identification. And the police called in. They said, we cannot take care of this. So we don't know where the order came from for them to camp outside the apartment, but they're there. So it's a de facto house arrest. That's persecution. It's not legal discrimination. If it's legal discrimination, you can try to change the law. But there's lawless persecution of Christians in China
Now,
today.
I want to get back to your actual question, which sort of addressed, can secularism under certain circumstances become like a religion or environmentalism like a religion? And if it's empowered to operate, say, in the public schools, and you've heard this from conservative Christians for a long time, that the public schools are sort of engines of indoctrination of values antithetical to their Christian beliefs and so forth. I'm wondering, Jacques, if that's really what you think of when you think of proper secularism.
No, it's definitely not what I think of. Boy, I'm just trying to restrain myself a little bit. So
That's all right, Jacques. It's late in the afternoon.
I don't want to be that guy, that secular guy. There's another definition of secularism which is not invoked frequently. And again, so I don't want to argue particular positions, but just so you know, I identify 9 definitions of secularism that all seem to be working at the same time, right? One of them is kind of state-sponsored atheism. We spoke about the Albanian case, right? And that's noxious stuff. I've even raised the possibility, following the professor, that it's just another form of establishment. So Wilfred Laclais writes I believe he calls this positive secularism, right? So positive secularism is a type of secularism that wishes to cram non-belief down your throat, right? We see it here and there. We definitely saw it in Albania. I believe in China we're seeing that as well. We're a very, very, very long way from achieving that low bar in the United States. So here's another definition of secularism, which is very rarely invoked, but it's always imbricated or enmeshed. Secularism believes that science and rationality should be the drivers of all public policy. So I want you all to think about that for a second. If you adhere to that conception of what a secular state is supposed to do, then you have absolutely no problem with kids getting all worked up about recycling, right? Because I do think the science is pretty strong, right? Even though I'm not on what is happening vis-a-vis our planet. And I think the scientists agree. Now, if we lived in a republic in which we agreed, and we haven't agreed, right, that science and rationality drive all of our public policy initiatives, game, set, and match. Like Christianity, take a seat. Judaism, take a seat. Baha'is, everyone go away. And what happens in school is fact-based learning in science. That's not anything that any American has agreed to. So if the complaint is, well, nobody ever said that is the definition of secularism that obtains in the United States, so why are we doing this in the public schools? Okay, I guess that's fair, right? But as I contemplate, I used to own a house in Battery Park City. That's right on the water. That's right where this terrible incident occurred yesterday. And I was told to sell the house really, really fast because the house is 10 feet away from the Hudson River. And it doesn't look like the house is going to be there that much longer, right? So, I mean, this is just a very small way of pointing to what climate change is doing. I would refer you to Thomas Friedman's editorial in the New York Times this morning. It's really, really, so if we're going to ignore it, and I've never even understood why some Christians, I should say, have this issue with climate change. To me, it's utterly puzzling, right? Even though I wrote about it in a previous book. I think most Christians don't have an issue with the fact that something very odd is happening to our climate, right? If that's the definition of secular that obtains, then fine. I understand why some are upset, because who said, where does it say in the Constitution that considerations of scientific, experimental scientific findings should drive our public policy? Okay, I get it. But that is the type of country that I'd like to live in, or at least I would like the public schools to work according to those canons.
All right. Is it Bennett? Yeah, Andrew.
Thanks. Just expanding upon Andrew Bennett, just expanding upon your point, Jacques. I'd like to maybe draw on sort of Charles Taylor's ideas of open and closed secularism. Typically, France's laïcité has been termed kind of a closed secularism. In Canada right now, we're going through some very odd experiences.
In Francophone or Anglophone Canada?
Both.
Okay.
In Francophone Canada, at least in Quebec, we just had passed last week a law by the National Assembly that bans the wearing of the niqab in public places in Quebec. Our erstwhile Prime Minister has defended this with his silence, whereas before he condemned it, before he was in office. That's a very clear expression of kind of a closed secularism that is being imposed within Quebec by the state. In the rest of Canada, and certainly in different provincial jurisdictions and also at the federal level, we're seeing increasingly what we were kind of talking about a little bit this morning, this idea whereby freedom of religion, freedom of conscience becomes diminished down to freedom of worship, or a very narrow subset of freedom of expression or freedom of association. And increasingly you're seeing in the rest of the country where there is this understanding that you can practice your faith in that building over there on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, or any other day of the week, or at home. But as soon as you come together in some sort of collectivity, a group of Catholic doctors who don't want to refer for abortion, a group of evangelical educators who want to have a law school at Trinity Western University in British Columbia, according to an honor code similar to BYU might have, and you're opposed by the law societies, and that's upheld by the courts. Now we're seeing a situation where you have this interesting closed secularism where there's a marginalization of people of faith from the public space. And two things happen. First, the public debate becomes impoverished because those people feel they cannot engage in the public square. And the knock-on effect of that is a diminished citizenship. So I'd like to get your thoughts. The Canadian situation is, frankly, I think, quite a bit different from the US situation. We have different historical roots, different understandings of religious freedom. But I would say we're about a decade ahead of where you are, and not in a positive direction. So I'd like to get your thoughts on the challenge whereby you have a diminishment of religious freedom, freedom of conscience, where if you're an individual expressing your religious freedom, okay. But as soon as you're in a collectivity in the public realm, in a profession, in schools, in universities, you can't really express your religious faith.
Any brief comments? I know Dan has got to catch a plane, and we've actually expended our time, but anyone want to comment?
I understand what you're saying, but I'm just wondering if that's a problem of like secular democracies, or if it's a problem in religious societies as well. Because if you look at like the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, it's called the Islamic Republic, you would think that you wouldn't have those issues, but actually you have them even more pronounced because there's so much diversity of Islam. And the problem is you don't have a body that's sitting there and saying, well, we are going to interpret what Islam means in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. So you have progressive Muslims, Sufis, Shias, Sunnis, hardline Sunnis, whatever modernists, whatever you want to call them. And yes, you have these very vague sort of laws that are written in the Constitution that say things like no law in the country should go against Sharia. But there are 7 legal schools, Islamic legal schools in the country, and no one's defining what Sharia law are we talking about. I mean, a simple example is what everyone gets very worked up about is birth control. So let's just talk about birth control in Pakistan. Pakistan has no issues with birth control. There are 7 Islamic legal schools that are active in the country, and it's pretty much this idea of like 3 of the legal schools are very liberal, and so they hearken back to a particular hadith which says that after a woman has a child, she breastfeeds for 6 months, which is implicitly saying it's okay to use birth control. Whereas the 3 other schools that are not as liberal use analogical reasoning to say, no, birth control is a problem. If you're a citizen in Pakistan, whichever legal school you follow, you either go buy your birth control pills or you don't. But no one's going to court over it, and no one's like shutting down, crying persecution over it either. So I'm just, I'm just thinking of this particular country which was supposed to bring people together because of a common religious identity, which has actually created more issues because there's too much diversity of religious thought within that one religion. And that's the thing that's causing a lot of freedom of conscious ideas or freedom of, so you have 10 Sunnis who get together and say, our interpretation of the Quran is this, and that causes problems for the Shia groups or the Sufi groups or the whatever, but it's all happening within one religion. So.
Can I just clarify?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dan. We probably should close down, return the conversation to after the panel. If we might.
I'm not running from secularism.
I want to thank our panelists, the organizers of this event. Thank you so much.
Well, and thank you all. It says in the program that I'm supposed to give closing remarks. I'm not going to do that. I'm sure many of you are sitting there thinking, here we sit and we're exhausted. As you've been here for a long time, I hope you have learned a great deal. The research that went into this project was an exercise in honesty, in self-criticism about the Christian tradition. I think we've learned from this panel and really from this entire process that no one has a monopoly on wisdom concerning religious freedom. If progress was made throughout history on the issue of religious freedom and on its practice, it's only as a result of a terrible, messy, complicated history in which too many people killed each other and persecuted each other, even when they shared the same faith. Hopefully from that hard experience, something has been learned. And clearly, Christians and others have learned a great deal from members of other religious communities, members of other philosophical traditions, from Stoicism, from secularism. And to be sure, I think it's fair to say the world has learned something also from Christian contributions. And if I may say thank you, Jacques, for your eloquent account of what the world perhaps has learned about secularism and secularity from the Christian tradition. So thank you all for being a part, as it were, of this conference itself, an exercise in inclusive religious freedom. We are grateful that so many different voices were able to participate. I'm so grateful to all the scholars who contributed to the 2 volumes. I'm extremely grateful to my dear friend and colleague, Alan Hertzke. And let me, if I may, say a closing thanks to all the saints that made this conference possible. Again, it's All Saints Day. Let me thank Nick Fedek, extraordinary senior project coordinator for the Religious Freedom Research Project, Claudia Winkler, director of communications for the Berkley Center, who made the publication possible that all of you have, Amy Vandervliet, also with the Berkley Center, Micah Musser, my research assistant who was with us the whole day manning the table, and all those from the Berkley Center, Michael Kessler, who began the conference. Please also let me thank the wonderful audiovisual crew who were here the whole day recording every single valuable word and every single interaction. So thank you all very, very much. I hope you'll have food for thought from our conversation, and hope you're equipped to be stronger, more effective advocates for religious freedom, for human dignity for everyone. We need more advocacy, intelligent, articulate, deeply rooted advocacy for human dignity and religious freedom for all people everywhere. Thank you for being here.